Welcome to the 18th video on ancient Greece and part 2 of the Great Peloponnesian War. Now, we ended the last video with that Spartan declaration of war in July of 432 BC, and we looked at some of the events that caused that. We took a look at Epidamnus, that rebellion at Potidaea, and then there was this so-called Megarian decree, which we will get to in a minute. And then we should always remember what Thucydides says is that the main reason for the war was the Spartan fear of Athenian growth. And so there's this idea that no matter what the Athenians did, the Spartans were going to go to war with them. And certainly Pericles thought that way, that this was a war that was unavoidable. Now, what's interesting about that Spartan declaration of war, of course, is that occurred in July of 432 BC. But the Spartans don't muster their army, and nothing happens for 9 months. So what is going on there? Usually when the Spartans declare war, their army is on the move a few days later. Remember, that is a year-round professional army, and they are ready for war at all times. But nothing happens. And I think what's going on here is that even though the Spartans declared war, there's always this conservative faction in Sparta that doesn't want to venture outside of the Peloponnesus. And at that meeting, whether Sparta is deciding to go to war or not, the actual Spartan king, Arkadiymian, actually speaks out against going to war. So the king is against it, but the Gerousia and the Ephors vote for it. And you have to also wonder how much control Corinth, and to a lesser extent Megara, played in convincing the Spartans to vote for war. Corinth actually threatened to leave the league if the Spartans didn't vote for war. So you have to wonder, whose league was this? And do the Spartans really have control over the Peloponnesian League? I mean, they could have told Corinth to go take a hike and to work out their own differences with the Athenians. But that's not what happens here. So you have to wonder if they did this to appease the Corinthians, and then for the next 9 months what actually happens is they try to actually negotiate with the Athenians. And so there are actually 3 diplomatic missions sent to Athens, and what happens there is Spartans place demands on the Athenians, and if the Athenians had accepted one of those demands, then the Spartans would have called off the war. So the first one is pretty silly. They actually ask the Athenians to remove Pericles. Now that wasn't going to happen. The Athenians say thanks, but no thanks. We handle our own politics, not you. The second one, though, caused intense debate within Athens. Now this was much more of a serious proposal from the Spartans. And what the Spartans asked the Athenians to do is to withdraw the Megarian decree. Now what the Megarian decree was, if you remember in the First Peloponnesian War, Megara left the Peloponnesian League and joined Athens. Well, you'll remember later on, Megara rebelled and then rejoined the Peloponnesian League. And that greatly angered the Athenians. So they issued this trade embargo against the Megarians so that nobody within the empire could do business with the Megarians. And again, many Athenians wanted to go ahead and accept that demand because what do they care about Megara? Fine, go ahead, lift the ban, and they can do business with anybody they want. And so there's this faction that wants to avoid war at all costs. And this is where Pericles rises and speaks against accepting that demand. And what he essentially says is, look, we can go ahead and give in to the Spartans, but if we do that, they will continue to victimize us. They will continue to make additional demands. And why not? Because that's the message that we've sent. That's what we're here for. Just go ahead and victimize us. And he also makes the point that the Athenians are in the right here. They have not broken the treaty. It's the Spartans who are breaking the treaty. So why should we give in to any demands that they make? In the end, the assembly votes to reject the Spartan demand. But they don't reject it outright. They actually send a list of counter demands to the Spartans. Now, I think Pericles knew full well that the Spartans would reject any counter proposals. But I think he was also trying to appease the Athenians that wanted outright peace in Athens. And so again, it's rejected, and a third diplomatic mission shows up with a final demand, and that one's almost as absurd as the first. They asked the Athenians to give up their empire, and of course, that was not going to happen. And so neither side would yield, and the war would continue on. It is sort of tantalizing to think about what would have happened with Corinth if one of those demands had been accepted by the Athenians, especially that second one to remove the Megarian decree. Well, we really don't know, but there is a possibility that Corinth might just have left the league because that's what they floated out there to the Spartans if the Spartans didn't go to war with Athens. So I think that's kind of interesting to think about in terms of what might have happened. But it's always worthwhile keeping in mind how much the Spartans were pushed by their allies. And they are pushing and pushing the Spartans in a particular war direction. So it's not just as simple as Sparta making the decisions in the Peloponnesian League. They are being constantly pushed by all of their respective allies in a certain direction. Okay, so the Spartans' message to the rest of Greece was simple. We are liberating you from these imperialistic Athenians. So you can see propaganda was alive and well even in those days. So now that Pericles realized the Spartans really were coming, he developed a two-pronged plan, and that is defense by land and offense by sea. This would play to the strengths of the Athenian armed forces and give the navy absolute priority in its overall strategy. And so to avoid the Spartan army at all costs, Pericles had the Athenian population in the countryside evacuated and placed inside the long walls of Athens. And since the Spartans lacked any siegecraft technology, they could hold out indefinitely and keep their population supplied by sea, and also keep that critical grain supply coming in from their various ports around the Mediterranean. So the entire key to Pericles' strategy is keeping control of the seas with their vaunted navy. Now this phase of the Peloponnesian War from 431 to 423 BC is called the Arkadiymian War, and it is named after the Spartan king Arkadiymus, who led the first attacks on Attica. Now you remember, he is the Spartan king who spoke against going to war against Athens. But since he was the king, he was expected to lead the attack. Now if you take a look at that map to the right, you can see that huge Spartan movement right there on land. And then all these little blue arrows are the Athenian navy. So that represents the strategy that Pericles will be taking over the next several years. Keep his navy in play and avoid the Spartan army at all costs. So finally in March of 431 BC, things finally get rolling. And it all starts with a Theban sneak attack on Plataea. Now the Thebans were allied with Sparta, and the Plataeans were allied with Athens. And so Sparta promised to help the Thebans, and Athens promised to help one of its closest allies in Plataea. Now, whether the Thebans were working in coordination with the Spartans in terms of this sneak attack on Plataea is unknown. Maybe they were just running an independent operation. But it seems a little bit suspicious since the Thebans were well aware that Spartans and Athens were at war. And with that, the Spartan army was on the move. A 60,000 man strong army marched through the isthmus and headed into the plains of Attica. And they made camp just a few miles away from Athens. And of course, the Athenians failed to appear. And so the Spartans are just sitting there waiting and waiting for the Athenians, and they must have thought the Athenians had become cowards, because tradition held that if a foreign invader destroyed your lands, you marched out there and fought them. But this was part of Pericles' overall grand strategy to avoid the Spartan army in the field. In any case, seeing the pillage of their farms, the Athenians were absolutely outraged. And many began to express their discontent with Pericles himself, because again, this went against the Greek code of fighting an invader when he takes over your lands. But even with this intense pressure from the farmers, Pericles did not give in, and he refused to alter his initial strategy. And so he continued to allow the Spartans to ravage the countryside. Pericles didn't remain completely idle, though. He began to execute the second phase of his plan and use his navy as his primary offense. And so he sent 100 ships to loot the coast of the Peloponnesus, while most of the Spartan army, of course, was just outside the walls of Athens. Finally, the first invasion came to an end when, after about a month, the Spartans got fed up with waiting for the Athenians and marched their army back to the Peloponnesus. And of course, one of the main reasons this was done is because they didn't want to stay out of the Peloponnesus for too long, because that would leave the Helots unsupervised and perhaps lead to another Helot rebellion. And maybe Pericles was counting on that all along. He certainly knew about all of the Spartan problems with the Helots. Now, in the following summer, in 430 BC, the Spartans launched yet another invasion. This time, the Spartans hung around for about 40 days and began looting Attica for a second time. But Pericles again refused to revise his initial strategy and launched another naval expedition to plunder the coast of the Peloponnesus. But the problem with this strategy was it was mostly a defensive strategy, because unless he was willing to take the field and defeat the Spartan army, these raids really had no chance of inflicting severe damage on the Spartans. I kind of like to think of it as a football game. Your football team might have a great defense and might be able to stop the opposing team from scoring points, but unless you can score points yourself, you're not going to be able to win the game. And so that's kind of what's going on here. Unless he defeats the Spartan army, he really has no chance of winning the war outright. So in a sense, he's kind of buying as much time as possible to keep Athens from falling. This strategy reminds me of how the Romans dealt with Hannibal. Now, Hannibal had destroyed much of the Roman army, and finally the Romans decided to institute this avoidance strategy, and they simply would wait Hannibal out. So they harassed Hannibal and placed most of their armies behind their walls, but they refused to take on Hannibal in a head-to-head confrontation. And the strategy worked, but it took almost 2 decades for the Romans to get Hannibal out of Italy. But eventually it worked. So that's kind of what Pericles is doing here. He's avoiding the Spartans at all costs and hoping that eventually things will settle down. But the long and short of it is neither side seemed to have a way to win this war. So a sort of stalemate ensues. But then one of those events occurs that you have no control over. And that's something that almost occurs in every war. You can do all the meticulous planning possible, but it's always those unforeseen events that can change the course of an entire war, something that you just simply can't plan for or anticipate. And in this case, in the summer of 430 BC, a plague broke out in Athens. And of course, since everybody was tightly packed behind the Athenian walls, the disease spread quite easily, killing thousands. It's estimated that 1/3 of the Athenian population died. And this caused serious disarray and social disorder within Athens. Now, the exact identity of the disease has never been determined, but in any case, it triggered a wave of public uproar, and Pericles was forced to defend himself in another speech. And so Pericles' enemies used this against him, especially a rising and dynamic protagonist of Pericles named Cleon. Cleon took Pericles to trial and was the public prosecutor of Pericles. Cleon eventually would be seen as more of a warmonger who wanted to directly confront the Spartans and toss out Pericles' avoidance strategy. Nevertheless, within just a year, in 429 BC, the Athenians not only forgave Pericles, but they re-elected him as general, and he was reinstated to the command of the Athenian army. But still, the plague continued, and Pericles witnessed the death of both of his sons from the epidemic. And later in that same year of 429 BC, it would claim Pericles himself. Now, this was the disaster for Athens, because it was Pericles who was the man with the plan. He had the overall grand strategy, and now after his death, the generalship would pass to more aggressive Athenians like Cleon. And as I said before, the plague killed almost 1/3 of the Athenian population. So things are really starting to go south for the Athenians. In fact, the plague was so bad that the Spartan invasion for several years was called off because the Spartans didn't want their troops to come in contact with the plague. So this was a huge turning point in the war, and saw the tide of the war turned into Sparta's favor. Now, around 427 BC, the island of Lesbos revolted from the Athenian Empire, believing that Athens was about to collapse. However, the Athenians showed great resilience and suppressed the revolt. Now, also in 427 BC, the Spartans resumed their offensive, and Arkadiymian invaded Attica again. However, once again, Arkadiymian was not able to inflict a severe defeat on the Athenians. And at the same time, the Athenian general Nicias also seized the small island of Minoa, which controlled the port of Megara. In the following year, Nicias also pillaged the island of Melos. So it's interesting, at the very brink of Athens falling apart, they were at least able to stabilize the situation. Now, as a result of the Spartans' failed attempts in Attica, they decided to go ahead and switch the strategy around and hit the Athenians outside of Attica. And they laid siege to Plataea in 427 and were able to take that city. And that was a strategic point that would allow the Spartans easy access into central Greece. So there's kind of this back and forth going on. The Athenians will seize a city, and then the Spartans will seize a city, but none of these actions alone would end the war. So just keep that in mind. It's kind of a back and forth that's going on here in the first part of the Peloponnesian War. Okay, that's going to do it for this video. In part 3 of the Great Peloponnesian War, we will move to the year 425 BC, and that's kind of a pivotal year where we will see the war start to change quite a bit. It becomes increasingly brutal and savage, and we'll get to that in the next video. See you guys then.